Ha, ha.
Shields and swords, field of wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
The Dream of the Rood is a really fascinating poem. It's very emotionally powerful. In fact, it's so emotionally powerful. I know one man who studied Old English and learned Old English solely because he read The Dream of the Rood in translation and was just so profoundly affected by it that he thought, I need to read it in the original language. And so he learned a whole language just to learn this one poem, just to read this one poem. So it's very powerful. Sometimes students can misunderstand what's going on, and it can be a little confusing. So first of all, let's talk about the genre. What kind of poem is this? This is something that we call a dream vision. And a dream vision was a very common genre in medieval and actually classical literature as well. And today we have these things like fantasy literature and science fiction literature that imagine a world that is familiar to us but unfamiliar in some ways. So let's say I want to tell a story, but I don't want the normal rules of our world to come into play. I want to change the rules of the world. Well, how can I do that? I can create a kind of fantasy literature. So for example, in my recent book, The Watch of Traxus, for that book, I don't have to do a lot of world building because we already all know what a fantasy world is like. And so the things that happen in there that seem more like a fantasy world, in fact, that are like a fantasy world, I don't have to create that world. It already exists culturally for us. And this is true for science fiction films, where if we want to change the rules, suddenly we go to another planet, or there are aliens that are like people, but they're different in some way, and we can affect that. Well, one other way of doing this is what's called a dream vision. And the idea is that a narrator, who's usually called a dreamer, right? So there's a narrator and then there's a dreamer, right? And they're almost the same, but not exactly the same. I'm going to treat them like they're the same here. But someone says, oh, I fell asleep and I had this dream. And in fact, we're not supposed to believe that they actually dreamt this when they went to sleep. There are no dream visions that say like, yeah, I had this crazy dream last night. I went to sleep and I was at my mom's house, but it wasn't really my mom's house. It was like a castle, but I knew it was my mom's house. Anyway, so you were there. Well, it was you, but you had a Lamborghini. Those aren't the way they sound. They're actually structured dreams, but it creates an imaginary world, and it allows us, just like in fantasy or science fiction, to suspend disbelief and say, okay, we know that the rules will be different in the dream world than they are here. And so what are the rules? And so, of course, in this dream, in the Dream of the Rood, the cross of the crucified Jesus, the cross of Christ, that cross appears to him kind of in a dream vision and speaks to him and gives the dreamer some information. So even when we know the author, so for example, Chaucer wrote a dream vision, we actually differentiate between Chaucer, the author, and then the dreamer himself in that case, right? All right, so it's a dream vision, and so I get the rules are different, but often what a lot of students do when they look at the Dream with the Dream of the Rood is they say like, well, there's this account of the crucifixion of Jesus that is nothing like the historical account. I mean, even if I'm not religiously a Christian, this doesn't seem to make any sense at all. What's going on here? So let's check that out here. Let's look at some of the text. Now, one of the important things to note about Jesus is that we have a lot of different things that happened in the account of his life. And so because of that, there isn't one single understanding of what we should emphasize in the life of Jesus, right? What are the things that Jesus did that are the most important? What are the things that Jesus did that matter? And different cultures will emphasize different things over time. So for example, if you look at this image on the right, it reminds me a lot of Jesus who was on the pictures of a lot of Protestant churches, especially when I was growing up. I sometimes call this cream rinse Jesus, very soft, very kind. He has a lamb. He's often depicted as being with children. This is a very gentle Jesus. But there are things about Jesus' life that were not so gentle. He spent the earliest part of his life fleeing from being murdered by someone who was afraid he was going to take over. He seems to have been some kind of builder. At least his father was. We have accounts of him, driving animals and flipping over moneylenders' tables out of the temple, fashioning a whip in doing that. It seems to be he was whipping the animals, it seems, not the people, but that's still a pretty aggressive thing to be doing. And when he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane to be executed, one of the interesting things is that one of his followers uses a sword to cut off someone's ear. And we like to focus on Jesus healing the ear, but not the fact that one of his followers is wandering around with a sword on. So that Jesus on the right there was the Jesus that was sort of in the churches that I remember when I was a child, whereas the Jesus on the left was the kind which was often favored in the northern Germanic tribes. The Jesus who is the conqueror, the Jesus who breaks down the gates of hell, Jesus who endures all kinds of suffering for humanity. And so if you look at that image on the left, that's a very typical image of the harrowing of hell. Notice how big Jesus is there compared to the other people. He's standing on the gates of hell and treading underneath his feet the devil, Satan himself. And this is a kind of hero Christ figure. And so sometimes when students will look at the Dream of the Rood, they'll think, well, who is this guy? Who this doesn't match any historical or religious account of Jesus that I might be familiar with today. And that's because the Jesus that we have today has moved away from the kind of heroic version of Jesus that they preferred. So when we look at the Dream of the Rood, we see in that account a little bit of what this is all about. So here we see this is at odds with the historical account of the crucifixion of Jesus. Even if you're going to say, well, I am so anti-Christian that I refuse to believe any part of the gospel accounts, fine, but this also would not be how the Romans would execute people. So this seems highly improbable and also not something that would literally have been believed by the people who were worshiping Jesus in Anglo-Saxon England. I saw the Lord of mankind, that would be Jesus, coming with great haste that he might climb up on me being the root of the cross here. All right, so we'll stop right there. I saw the Lord of mankind, fine, coming with great haste. Actually, the accounts have Jesus he was beaten and tortured all night, so he had lost so much blood that he struggled to carry his own cross and someone else had to carry it for him. So he didn't come with great haste at all. But here in this account, he does, so he might climb up on me. Again, Jesus doesn't climb up on his cross. He is nailed to it. Then I did not dare act against the Lord's word. So here we have the Rood saying, look, it was Jesus who told me to stay up. I did not dare act against the Lord's word, bow down, or fall to pieces when I felt the surface of the earth trembling. And so there's an earthquake in part of the accounts. Here we have him saying, the Rood saying, well, I might have fallen down, but Jesus told me not to. So I obeyed. And so here we see Jesus is a heroic figure, but we also see that the Rood itself is a follower of Jesus, a warrior, a loyal warrior that will do as is commanded. Although I might have destroyed the foes, I stood in place. Right. So here we see this. Also, the Rood is a warrior, but the Rood is stalwart and is not moving, is not attacking by falling on top of the Roman soldiers or whatever. Then this young man stripped himself. that was God Almighty, strong and courageous. All right. This is interesting because, again, this takes part of the gospel accounts and flips it. In the gospel accounts, Jesus doesn't strip himself. He is stripped by the Romans, who then gamble for his clothes. And it's not just a small detail that is given as an important prophetic detail. And so it seems the poet and his audience would have known this, and he's flipping this here and saying that, well, it's basically, since Jesus is God, then he's in control. So he stripped himself, strong and courageous. He climbed on the high gallows. Again, we have him climbing up on the cross. Brave in the sight of many as he set out to redeem mankind. I trembled when the man embraced me. So it's not Jesus being nailed to the rood, but embracing him. I dared not bow down to earth, stoop to the surface of the earth, but I had to stand fast. I was reared a rood. I raised up a mighty king, the heavens Lord. I dared not bow in homage. So here in the dream of the rood, this account, we see the heroic Christ. We see the kind of Jesus who was favored by this audience. Another interesting thing to look at is really what suffering is like for the dreamer in the dream of the rood. So one of the things often I think when we think about medieval life, we think about physical, the physical privations, the kinds of things that we might not have. Like they didn't have, television. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They didn't have all these things. They must have been miserable because of that. But of course, you don't miss the things that you never had. Instead, the way that they thought about privation was emotional privation, the things that they lost. And so notice that in the dream of the rood, the dreamer is not upset. In the end, when he comes out of his dream, he doesn't sit there and think about all the ways his life is physically bad with losing his friends, but about being emotionally bad because he's the last of his friends alive, or one last of the few. I possess but few friends on this earth, but forth from here they have set out from worldly joys to seek the King of glory. So he's saying, like, most of my friends are dead. But, and notice he's saying, I don't have many friends left here. They dwell in heaven now with the high Father, living in glory, and I look forward constantly toward that time when the Lord's rood, which I beheld here on this earth, shall fetch me away from this fleeting life. And so here the rood is not just a method of executing Jesus, but is in fact almost like the angel that's coming to gather his loyal followers to him. Fetch him away from this fleeting life and bring me then to where bliss is eternal, to joy in paradise, where the Lord's people are joined at that feast, where joy lasts forever. And so here we also see things, often when students read this, they think about Norse mythology and the kind of the feasts that, the kind of Viking feast that you might imagine, Valhalla. And if this seems like it is an image of heaven that's similar to that, that's not surprising when you have a certain kind of cultural value like that. The value of physically gathering together to feast and to be with your friends, and that's the center of how life should work, then again, it's not surprising that this is the kind of thing, the kind of way that the dreamer thinks about the dream of the rood. Okay, so as you can see, the dream of the rood gives us, a culturally appropriate view of Jesus that emphasizes the masculinity, the strength, the warrior nature of Jesus, more than perhaps modern American culture would. It looks at things like emotional deprivation, where when we look at the Middle Ages, we see it one way, but they saw that as normal life, and really, the kinds of things that really make us sad, are the loss of friends, the loss of family over time. When we think about death, for example, we often think about it as a sense of loss, more so than the process of dying. Of course, depending on how one dies, that process can be painful and miserable and can have all sorts of physical deprivations. But ultimately, we think about it as the emotional deprivation of not being able to just talk to that person as we normally would. So one last thing before we go, you will notice my change of clothes that's occurred. It's because it took a very, very long time for the video of the PowerPoint to render. and so I had to leave, and this is the next day. So the world seems to have gone on, and please enjoy a second sweater from me today.